Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Now, let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. So sometimes in life, you come through a situation where you're faced with either a step-parent or a step-child. It's something that apparently is very common, which I actually didn't know how common it was. So today, to talk about it a little bit more, we're going to be talking into how to make a second marriage work. And to guide us through the process and to help us understand this a little bit more is Dr. Caroline Sander. How are you going today, Caroline?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm very good. It's very early this morning, and it's I've had so much coffee to keep me awake already, so it's insane.
Well, I am. It's late here in the U.S., but I'm really happy to be here today.
Okay, perfect. I'm really excited for you to be here as well. I think I've said in previous episodes how this is a very specific topic to me and how I'm so excited to talk about this when it comes to step parents and step siblings and all those situations, how common it really is. And it's crazy how common it actually is in today's society.
Very common. I think both in the U.S. and in Australia, the statistics are about 1 in 10 children are raised in step families. Mm-hmm. So it's a very common family form, and it's also a family form that's been around for a really long time. It's not a modern family form, even though that's kind of a popular myth that all of a sudden step families are on the radar. So I'm excited to talk more about step family life, but you're right. It's a super common family form, no question.
So can you talk about how you got into studying this? Is it more of a passion project that sort of turned into a career?
Yes, is the short answer. Okay. Most people who do research in some ways are studying some personal interest of theirs, right? There's a phrase that all research is me search, that we're essentially researching ourselves. I myself was raised in a step family. My parents are divorced and remarried and re-divorced. There's a lot of family transition. And I grew up with really different models in different households of step family life. I had in my dad's second marriage an example of a really foundational to my own life, incredibly important and stable step family model. And then in another step family household that I grew up in, there was a lot of turbulence, and that was a remarriage that essentially ended in re-divorce. And so I've had a lot of exposure to different examples of step family life, and that got me really curious professionally to study the contexts and the processes that contribute to healthy or less than healthy family dynamics.
Wow, it's how often does sort of the changes in dynamics occur? Because like you said, there's different influences of different families. And so the constant changing of that, was that something that was different to sort of slip back into between two different families?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Probably like any child, you don't realize that it's normal or abnormal because it's all that you know, right? Mm-hmm. And so you kind of adjust to those transitions. But looking back, and now that I study it professionally, it really is interesting to see how the step family households that I grew up in were so different in so many ways. And ultimately, I think it just made me very curious about why that was. Mm-hmm. I probably felt it at the time, but didn't have the language until much later to really look into that more deeply.
Oh, wow. It's very interesting how you talk about the me turn into research. And I think that was the quote, research is essentially me search. And I think like I'm going to highlight that as quote of the day because that is very interesting to me. So while we're on the topic of you and sort of how you got into this, we're going to do a little icebreaker game that we love to start with every guest that comes on. It's sort of a get to know you kind of thing. So when I say these phrases, just say the first thing that comes to your mind.
Great.
Okay. So the first one is your favorite book.
My favorite book is probably Sex at Dawn, which is a book by Ryan and Jetha that essentially explores our prehistoric ancestors' organization of family life. So the full title is something like Sex at Dawn, How We Mate, Why We Stray, and What It Means for Our Modern Relationships. But more than that, it really is a historical examination of how the ways in which humans have formed families is really different from what we often think that it is. And so there's another book that is similar to that. It's called The Way We Never Were by Stephanie Coontz. And that book also comes to mind for me because that's also a historical analysis of families. And we have often this nostalgia for like the traditional family era. And that book really challenges the extent to which that ever actually existed. And so both of those books challenge a lot of what we think we know about families from a historical perspective. So I would say those two come to mind immediately.
Wow, those are very interesting and very in-depth topics as well. It's definitely not in a quick read kind of book.
That's right. Neither of them. They are tense. Yes.
So the next one is your favorite movie.
My favorite movie, because we're talking about step families, I have to say the movie Stepmom, which stars Julia Roberts and Susan Sarandon as the mom and stepmom in a family that's undergone divorce and remarriage. It's fabulous. I love that movie and all that it represents in terms of the real things that families go through when they're divorcing and remarrying. And I think it shows everyone's perspective, mom's perspective, dad's perspective, stepmom's perspective, the children's perspectives, and shows the complexity for what it really is. So I love that movie. It's excellent.
No, I definitely agree. I love how they show the different areas and the different ways that a relationship can be built as well. So I love that movie. It's probably one I watch once a year because I get so teary that I have to really make sure that I'm not getting affected by it or have anything up next day.
Oh, I love that you've seen it multiple times. So have I. And I don't know how popular that movie even is, but it's more popular than I thought, I guess. I love that you've also seen it.
Okay, perfect. Because the next one is your favorite podcast.
I listen to a lot of podcasts. My favorites are probably one titled All My Relations, which is a podcast about indigeneity and indigenous communities and family life, and really explores our relationships to our ancestors, to each other, to the land. And so in that is a way of thinking about family that I tend to apply to my research about how we're interconnected in ways that might be complicated, but that are also really beautiful. And so I love that podcast. I also love the Ezra Klein Show, which is a podcast that explores a whole host of topics. And a lot of my more recent interests are gleaned from that show. So that's another go-to for me.
Well, it's very interesting how much it is influenced by the different understandings of people and how they make a show just on that as well. Yeah. So the next one is your famous role model of yours.
That's a little tricky for me, but the person who comes to mind is Ada Limon, who is the U.S. Poet Laureate. And I came into her work relatively recently, so I don't know that I have a all-time famous role model who I think of instantly, but she's certainly who I'm thinking of right now. She is she's a poet, and as a poet, she's incredibly perceptive to and curious about the world around her. And as a scientist, right, I try to not take the world around me for granted, but to question it and to name those invisible dynamics, for example, those in family life. And so, her work really makes me stay open and curious. I think there's a lot to be learned from thinkers and writers who are curious about the world around them.
It seems like another personal project of hers that turned into what she does for a living. So that's another.
I think that's right. And she also comes from family complexity. So she has beautiful poetry about divorce and step-family life. And so I'm sure subconsciously that is, what resonated with me as well.
Oh, well, that sounds like a really interesting person as well. The last one is a favorite course of yours that you've completed.
In my graduate studies, I took a lot of courses on gender in families. And so anything pertaining to gender dynamics in families has been a home of mine. I majored in family science and pursued my PhD in family science more broadly, but I minored in gender, women and gender studies. And so I'm really interested in how gender comes into play in divorce and remarriage. So all of my classes about that were probably my favorite.
Oh, wow. I think it's amazing how much it sort of created your whole life and sort of really took over into its own little genre of its own in your head.
That's right. Yeah. It did.
So this brings us to what we're talking about today, which is remarriage and sort of the how to make a second family work and second marriage work. To start off with, I know everyone has their own very different definition of family. To you, what is family defined as?
It's a great question, but I think family is in the eye of the beholder, right? We tend to readily recognize family by blood or family by marriage, but most of us also have family by choice, people who we wouldn't technically consider family in a biological or legal sense, but who we consider family nonetheless. And I think too that there is no universal definition of family because, of course, we know that family has looked so differently across history and across cultures in terms of how people have organized family life. And the Sex at Dawn book that I mentioned, right, really maps some of that. So all evidence points to our prehistoric ancestors having lived in communal societies in which everything from food to child rearing was shared. And so adults would have had several ongoing romantic relationships at any given time. Mm-hmm. And these practices obscured paternity in a way that bonded communities in ways that made sure all adults were equally invested in all children and the rearing of their young. And so all of that to say, family complexity is, I think, the reality of our species. And so in many ways, the complex family forms that we see today, families formed and reformed by divorce and remarriage and redivorce, these complex kinship structures that we see are in some ways a return, I think, to the family form of our collective past. And so there's so much diversity and fluidity in terms of how we think of family. It's very hard to define it. It's one of those very ambiguous terms. Certainly we have definitions provided by the census that help track family. Mostly we're talking about households when we talk about it from a census perspective. Mm-hmm. So there are those definitions, but those usually don't capture our personal definitions, right, of what family looks like and means to us.
Yeah, I think especially when it comes to the legal sense as well, when you talk about family, you say, okay, you're married to this person, that's your family, and that's sort of who they count as family. Whereas like a lot of people, like you say, personal ways, you could see friends as family, you could see so many different people that's not really blood related as family members. And it's really interesting how everyone has their own definition.
Yes, in my classes, I try and have my students do an exercise where they have to define family, pretend like they're writing a definition for a textbook, and how would you define family? And it's hard, right? They come up with lovely and beautiful definitions, but usually where people ultimately end up is the idea of, well, sure, family could be those we live with. It could be those we're biologically or legally related to, or the families we're raised in. But usually when we think of family, we're thinking of something so much bigger, affection and love and support. And so that makes defining family so expansive.
Yeah. And I think the ideology of family is very much someone there to support you and to be a part of your life. So sometimes that you don't get from blood relatives. So you separate the blood relatives from family as well.
Absolutely.
So what do you think the position of a family holds in today's society?
Yeah, I think that contrary to narratives about the decline of the family, right, or the decline in traditional family values, for example, we hear a lot of these ideas, but I think it's undeniable that families fulfill many important functions in society, arguably more so than they ever have. I mean, families are responsible for a host of things that society relies on them to be responsible for, right? Things like reproducing and socializing children, teaching the rules and the expectations and the culture of society. Economic cooperation, right? Families are generally responsible for providing its members with food and shelter and clothing, and certainly care and warmth and intimacy. I mean, providing support to family members, caring for aging family members, right? We see that the lifespan is greater today than, at other points in history. And so the increased longevity of human life means that, well, who's responsible for caring for the elderly, right? And often that falls to families. I mean, the less support, for example, that a government provides in fulfilling these needs, the more important that families are in providing these services. And so families are incredibly important to the fabric of society.
So do you think it holds a very different way to what it used to do, sort of like 10 or 20 years ago? Like the whole idea of family is very different to what we understand it now.
I don't think it's changed as much as we might think. I think that families are still responsible for providing basic needs in ways that they always have been. In other eras, when the economic production of society happened on like a family farm or within a family business, for example, families were still responsible for economic cooperation and for providing its family members with basic needs. Today, we see, work-life balance looks really differently, but families nonetheless are still responsible for fulfilling those needs. So I think the way that it looks has changed, but I think in terms of what families fundamentally do for their members has not changed as much, although it looks very different. But at the core, I think it's the same.
Okay. So going into talking about stepfamilies and sort of remarriage, how would you define a remarriage situation?
Sure. Well, a remarriage is a marriage in which one or both partners have previously married and divorced. But when we talk about remarriage, we're usually talking about stepfamilies, right? Stepfamilies are those in which one or both adults have children from a prior relationship. And so remarriages don't necessarily involve children, for example, and stepfamilies don't necessarily involve remarriage. You could have a couple who divorced without children and then remarried someone without children, and that remarriage would resemble a first marriage, presumably, because it doesn't involve the merging of two family systems with kids, for instance. Stepfamilies, right, may or may not be remarried. So some stepfamilies are first married families. If someone had children but wasn't married to their children's other parent, and then they marry for the first time, but they have children from a prior union, right? Then it would be a first married stepfamily. And of course, stepfamilies can exist outside the context of marriage altogether. You could have two people living with one another who aren't married, but who both have children from prior unions, and we would call that a cohabiting stepfamily. So my work tends to focus on stepfamilies, assuming that there are children involved or that there are children living in the household. And most remarriages do include stepchildren. About 2/3 of remarriages include children from a prior union. So when we talk about remarriage, if we're talking about children being involved, then I often frame it as stepfamily dynamics, recognizing that stepfamilies are those in which there are children.
Okay. So there is a huge difference between a stepfamily and just a normal remarriage. Okay. It's very interesting because when you always, especially in the way that you define, that people usually define remarriage, is that it has a sort of, it doesn't really talk about the difference between, okay, this is when with children. They just talk about remarriage as a whole, and it's under the umbrella of stepfamilies, whereas it's a completely different situation in some cases.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And I think that people who are remarried who don't have kids probably don't call their second marriage a remarriage. I do think we tend to use that language assuming that there are children involved, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so much variability in terms of what remarriages could look like or what stepfamilies could look like. That some stepfamilies are remarried, but some of them aren't. Some of them are first married, which is also interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting how in-depth it can get, and how definitions are very, very different. And like the label of it is very different as well.
Yeah. And I think maybe part of it has to do with the term stepfamilies. I've seen an aversion to identifying as a stepfamily, in part because of negative stereotypes or myths about stepfamilies that people might shy away from. And so I think that part of our tendency to term or to claim remarriage over claiming stepfamily as a family identity might have to do with some of those stereotypes.
Okay. Now, is there a difference in people's situations between a first marriage and a second marriage?
So assuming that the second marriage has children and the first one doesn't, right? There are certainly differences. Probably the biggest one being that in a remarriage with children, so in a stepfamily, the parent-child relationship predates the spousal relationship, right? In a first married family without kids, a couple has time to gradually get to know one another and establish ways of interacting and communicating and establishing traditions and rituals, and then bringing children into the family, right? With that foundation present. And in a stepfamily, you are merging two family systems that probably have really different histories, different ways of relating to each other and communicating and interacting, different traditions. And so you have a lack of shared history that can sometimes cause conflict because you're kind of thrust into this ongoing system of child rearing, especially for, couples who are remarrying and have children from prior unions. They're having to figure out a lot in real time, whereas first married couples have time to gradually develop those dynamics before introducing kids. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the parent-child relationship is longer in remarried stepfamilies than the spousal relationship introduces a really interesting dynamic, because the parent and child has more shared history with one another, right? Mm-hmm. That's different in first married families. And that can create a host of possible dynamics, such as step parents feeling like outsiders to the parent-child relationship, right? parents feeling possibly, especially if their child and their new spouse doesn't get along and there's conflict between step parents and stepchildren, then the parent is in a really interesting potential loyalty bind where they feel torn between their child and their spouse, right? And so those dynamics are heightened. Certainly there's the possibility of loyalty binds in first married families, but step families or remarried families are especially vulnerable to those loyalty binds.
Mm-hmm. And so with the understanding of the sort of traditional family structure, the change when introducing another figure, is there a huge change to introducing sort of that another parental figure, whether it's whether they're parental or not?
Tell me more what you mean.
So, for example, if introducing a new person into the children's life, into sort of the family dynamic that already exists, is there a huge change that sort of occurs when introducing that person in?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on a lot of factors. So for example, how young children are when a step parent comes into the family can shape things differently. So younger children tend to be more receptive to new step parents coming into the family system. Younger children generally have fewer memories of their parents being together. And so having a new step parent might be less upsetting or less threatening. Adolescents or older children who have more memories of their parents having been married and having separated tend to be more resistant to step parents entering the family system. So how smooth or difficult it is can depend on things like the ages of the children, and also how quickly or gradually it happens in terms of introducing a new adult or a new parent figure into the family. When it happens suddenly, it tends to be more of a shock to the family system, especially from children's perspectives, than when that introduction happens slowly and gradually, in the way that it would if you were introducing a friend slowly to a family over time. Mm-hmm. So there are lots of different factors that can shape how much of an impact the introduction of a step-parent figure has on the family dynamic.
Okay. Now, talking a bit more about sort of the second marriage and sort of the second relationship that exists in the family structure, is there a difference in how people approach a first marriage to a second marriage?
I don't know that there's much difference. I think that often there tends to be a lack of communication for both first marriages and second marriages in terms of things like parenting philosophies, right? Are we on the same page about how we're going to raise our kids? There's evidence that that doesn't happen as often as we might like it to happen in first married families. It also is not extremely likely to happen before remarriages, but the consequences of that arguably are greater for second marriages or step families, right? Mm-hmm. If you are merging two families and you haven't had conversations about, well, who is in charge of which parenting tasks? What role are you going to serve in my kids' lives? What role am I going to serve in your kids' lives, right? Are you going to be an authority figure? Do you have disciplinary authority? Are you allowed to discipline my kids? Am I allowed to discipline yours? How do we feel about that? Do I want you being a parent figure, or should you be more of a friend to my kids, right? Like, these are really important conversations to have before a remarriage. And they tend to not happen very often. When they do happen, and when couples are on the same page about these things, it puts them at lower risk for divorce. But when those conversations don't happen, it can put people at risk for dissatisfaction and dissolution. So it's not that people necessarily approach a second marriage differently, but not having those conversations is even more consequential within a second marriage, if that makes sense.
No, it does.
Yeah. I also think that there can be a false optimism. And here's what I mean by that. People who have divorced and are remarrying, having already gone through it once, tend to feel more confident going into their second marriage. And if we assume that it will be smooth sailing because we've learned so much from our first marriage and the second one surely is going to work out, then we can sometimes approach it with unrealistic expectations. So we have to brace ourselves for what's to come. And having unrealistic expectations can also set us up for a lot of disappointment and possibly divorce. So the importance of approaching it cautiously and with a lot of communication is even more important, I would say, going into a second marriage.
So it's sort of like you go in with experience, but somehow you don't think that you've learned a lesson or you've learned something from it.
Right. I think that that experience can certainly help us. And I think that also what we know is that remarriages are more likely to end in divorce than first marriages. So the divorce rate for a second marriage is higher than for a first marriage. And that can be surprising to some folks because often people think, having learned so much from the first go around, that they'll approach the second one really differently. But we do see higher divorce rates for second marriages. And so I think it's good to feel that we have experience coming out of our first marriage that can help us in our second one. But it is important to be realistic about the challenges that we will encounter and to normalize those challenges. It doesn't mean that something's wrong or that you've made the wrong decision in choosing to blend your families. But there are things that have to be worked out along the way. And if we aren't realistic about that, it can set us up for a lot of disappointment.
I think it's also really interesting to me when it comes to the authority figure in the sort of step family, in the blended family sort of situation, because some parents don't have, like, they already have two sets of parents in a way. And then you bring on this other person as a third authority figure, and that can be one too many people raising the kids. So it's like trying to understand where the step parent fits into all that is something that I think we don't really have a huge understanding on.
That's exactly right. I mean, the role of a step parent is ambiguous. We don't know exactly what it means to be a good step parent. If you ask people, what does it mean to be a good parent? What does it mean to be a good mother? What does it mean to be a good father? People will generally have a lot of consensus about what that looks like or what it should look like. But if you ask people, what does it mean to be a good stepmother? What does it mean to be a good stepfather? There's less consensus on what that looks like. And so the ambiguity of that role can be stressful for step parents who aren't really sure of how to do it well. And in their uncertainty, they might reach for models that are reminiscent of nuclear family models. So what I mean is, I don't know what it means to be a good stepfather, so I'm just going to act like a father because that's a model that I'm familiar with, right? And of course, if you approach it that way, it can cause a lot of friction in terms of disciplining and who has authority to do that. And the step parent role is different. And so the lack of clarity, there's no manual, there aren't guidelines for how to do it well. And so a lot of step parents are kind of figuring it out along the way and stumbling along the way because we don't have a lot of clarity and consensus about what these roles should look like, which is why it's so important for couples before they remarry to talk about what they both expect it to look like so that they're on the same page about that moving forward.
No, I think the communication is very, very something that is needed, especially in a second marriage with all that many different ways of handling situations that they've learned from the first relationship. So other than that, what are some other key elements that can sort of strengthen the relationship particularly in a second marriage?
Yeah, great question. First, I'll just punctuate again, having realistic expectations. I think that there are a lot of myths and stereotypes that can set us up for disappointment. So I think the two biggest myths or misconceptions about what stepfamily life could look like is that either stepfamilies should be just like first married families, or stepfamilies are really dysfunctional, right? The stereotype of the wicked stepmother, the evil stepmother, horrible stepfathers, right? There's an idea that stepfamilies are either perfectly functional or very dysfunctional. And of course, often it's somewhere, it's no different from any other, family dynamic where there are challenges. And of course, there are also successes. And so I think that the idea that you'll approach it or that it will go very, very smoothly, that, because we've fallen in love with each other, all of our kids will get along and your kids will love me and my kids will love you. And the myth of instant love, and I think this is especially a myth that we think women should live up to in terms of maternal love, like for a stepmother to love her stepchildren instantly and immediately, is very unrealistic. And, relationships take time. Step-parents should befriend their stepchildren first, get to know them first, and love comes later. So I think that the unrealistic expectations can create a lot of stress. So that's the first thing I would recommend for couples, is to have realistic expectations that love takes time, relationships take time, and it doesn't have to be picture perfect from the outset. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I would certainly recommend talking about parenting expectations for all the reasons that I said. There's a lot of research on this. I mean, there's a lot of research that shows that when couples talk about it, first of all, there's a lot of research that most couples don't, but that when they do, and when they reach consensus, they are less likely to divorce. So being on the same page is so important. So talking, communicating about those expectations is critical. Discipline is worth punctuating also, just because it tends to come up in stepfamily research so often. Research shows that child development and that stepfamily functioning is best when biological parents continue to be the primary disciplinarian, right? Especially early in stepfamily formation, and especially for adolescents. And even as step-parents gradually become more involved in the co-parenting system over time, generally step-families operate best when biological parents are supported by step-parents in their disciplinary decisions, but that they are the captain of those decisions. Another really important thing for folks to remember if they're forming a step-family is to spend one-on-one time with everyone. That all relationships need one-on-one time, and to especially spend one-on-one time with children. Mm-hmm. Children whose parents are remarrying often have fears about what this new step-parent means in terms of the loss of their relationship with their parent, the loss of their one-on-one time with their parent, especially if they were living with their parent in a single parent household before the remarriage. Those relationships likely became very close, right? And so the introduction of a step parent can be hard for kids because they feel like they're losing something. And there's a lot of fear and uncertainty about how this new person is going to disrupt the parent-child relationship. And so parents often, understandably, are so eager for their kids to bond with the person that they've fallen in love with, right? And so they want to do everything together and they want to do it as a family. And that's wonderful, and that should happen. But if it doesn't happen alongside carving out special one-on-one time with children, then children are less likely to be receptive to this new step-parent figure. So it is so important that parents continue to prioritize the maintenance of their relationships with their kids who don't feel lost in the shuffle of this new step-family forming. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it's also important, research shows, to spend time together as a step-family. One-on-one time is important. Together time also is important. There's research, for example, that shared meals can really build a sense of step-family cohesion. So the more nights per week that step-families have shared family meals, the more positive outcomes that children experience in step families. And so it's a balance of prioritizing all these individual relationships and prioritizing time spent together as a step family.
It's very interesting how you have to try to balance, like, especially when it comes to for example, the biological father who's having to deal with the new partner, and then as well as the previous relationships, children that comes from there as well. I think for me, I really relate this to the second Enchanted movie that came out very recently. It's very much related to that in a sense of the new relationship also has a new child that's sort of come from there, which left the stepchild very insecure in her own relationship with the rest of the family. So it's very interesting just how much we don't realize how it impacts, especially children from a first marriage. Like the relationship with the original father, with the biological father, is just as important as trying to build a relationship with the mother as well, with the new stepmother.
Oh, absolutely. And that's such a great example of the birth of a shared child in the step family, right? A child between parent and step parent.
Yeah.
So often, because it's a joyous time, and that can be true. And also children, even if they're happy about that, can struggle with what that means for their place in the family. And so often parents who are really well-intentioned forget to check in with their kids about how they're feeling amid all of these changes. Mm-hmm. And it's no different from parenting in any other context, that asking children how they're doing, checking in with them, sitting down with them and really talking and getting on their level and asking, right, how are you feeling about this? And what's going on for you? And are you scared about anything? And right, telling children, sometimes I struggle with change, and here's an example of that. What about you? Right? Like, it's so important to connect with kids on just that human level, for them to adjust well to all of these changes. And sometimes we just parents forget how to model that, how to really model open communication, checking in with kids. Because, and also, I suppose, to normalize complicated emotions, because often children are possibly excited for their parent, excited for this new sibling, and also have a lot of other feelings about that. And so normalizing that it's okay, that feeling sad, feeling a sense of loss, feeling scared doesn't take away from any other positive emotions that children might also be feeling. So I think there's so much to be said for just normalizing the complicatedness, the messiness of these transitions.
Yeah. And so now we're going to talk a bit more about some of the myths and misconceptions that come about in a second marriage. So what do you think are some of the most common misconceptions that occur?
Yeah, I think that certainly the myth of instant love, right? The myth that everyone should love each other easily and immediately is a big one. Mm-hmm. Love takes time. Always. That's no different in step families than in any other context. And so I think the pressure to love each other right away, to call each other family labels, right? To call my new step grandmother grandma, right? Or to call my new stepmom mom, whatever that might look like, that pressure to reconfigure as a first married nuclear family, the idea that we should instantly love each other, is a myth. It doesn't work that way. And so I think that dispelling that myth can take a lot of pressure off families, because the reality is that these relationships do take time. They take time. And all the research suggests that relationships do become better over time. The first 5 years of remarriage or step family formation tend to be the most stressful. And so a lot of step families that dissolve because the remarriage ends in divorce, it tends to happen within those first 5 years. from there, relationships do tend to become closer. And so I think dispelling the myth of instant love is incredibly important. And then also the flip side of that coin, the myth of dysfunctionality, the myth of the evil step-parent. There are real consequences that those myths can have. A lot of my work on stepmotherhood and talking with step-parents about their experiences, and especially stepmothers, suggests that they're incredibly reluctant to share some feelings that are incredibly normal. Any challenges that they're experiencing in step-family life, they might be reluctant to talk about out of fear of reinforcing these negative stereotypes, such as the stereotype of the evil stepmother, right? And so those negative stereotypes or myths can also make people really reluctant to be honest and open and to normalize the difficulty of some of these circumstances while also celebrating everything that they're grateful for and that they cherish about their families.
And so now, like, talking about the evil stepmother and all of that, why is it such a focus on the evil stepmother and not more on like a negative impact of what a stepfather would look like?
It's an interesting question. Interestingly, I mean, certainly many of us are familiar with the fairy tales that portray an evil stepmother, right? So a lot of it comes from that. But interestingly, most of those fairy tales in their original renditions featured biological mothers as the antagonist. And then in the 18th century, there was a concerted effort to kind of restore the sacred image of motherhood. And so all of these evil moms were turned into evil stepmoms.
Wow.
And the original rendition of Snow White has the antagonist being a biological mother. And then again, that's transformed into a stepmother. So there are certainly I think that those fairy tales that we're familiar with through Disney or what have you, have over time contributed to certainly the idea of a wicked stepmother. I think that women in particular, I think that stepmothers in particular are at the intersection of very complicated expectations in terms of how to be a stepmom. So what I mean by that is women are generally expected to be highly involved in families, right? Women as kin keepers, women as maternal figures, women as nurturers. So on one hand, women are expected to be highly involved. And then on the other hand, stepmothers as a step parent are expected to be less involved. And so they're expected to be both highly involved as women in step families, but simultaneously less involved as a step parent. And so that can create a really tricky set of expectations in terms of how to best enact their role as stepmoms. So I think the gendered dynamics and the complexity of women's roles in families in particular has put stepmothers in a really interesting spot. Not to suggest that being a stepfather is a cakewalk. I don't think that that's true. But I do think that the stereotypes attached to stepmoms warrant special attention.
And I think especially when it comes to, I think we referenced Stepmom, the movie earlier. The way that the children view Julie Roberts' character was very much like, oh, it's an evil stepmother. It's everything negative about it, when she's really trying so hard to be able to fit into those kids' lives. It's very interesting how they portray that.
Absolutely. And she is trying so hard to walk that fine line and being involved, but not overstepping, right? A lot of stepmothers describe the experience of they're supposed to do all these things, but not overstep. They're not supposed to infringe upon the mother's role, for example. And I think that some of these dynamics come from the ideologies of motherhood that culturally we tend to embody. So, for example, the primacy of mothers' roles in families, right? This is like a very heteronormative family image, but the idea that families should have, that children should have, they have one mother, right? They have one mother, and this one woman is expected to be all of these things. If you think about the negative stereotypes of stepmoms, we have very opposite stereotypes of biological maternity, which is like the supermom, the revered supermom who can do everything and is involved and is maybe a working mom, but she's still unconditionally there and supportive and loving. She does it all. And I think that because we place so much emphasis on mothers' roles, then the introduction of a stepmother can create a lot of friction, because we have been taught to believe that there is one mother figure. And how do you create space then for another maternal figure in families? The movie Stepmom is a great example of the mom really struggling with that. And there's a lot of emotion work that she's doing to create space for this new woman in her children's lives. But I think that's hard for moms to do, because we have been taught that they should be it all, that they should embody everything, which makes it difficult for stepmothers to figure out their role in the family.
No, 100%. And that whole movie really described it so well for me, especially in a way that is very spoken about all different parts that are dealing with it.
Yeah, it really does. It covers so many different facets of not only remarriage, but divorce. Something, that we haven't hit on yet, but that is true in terms of how remarriages differ from first marriages, is that family members are sometimes carrying emotional baggage from everything they went through in the divorce that they experienced. And so there can be scars that haven't healed, perhaps, right? Wounds that haven't healed that contribute to all of these complicated feelings involved in step families. And so you get some of that in the movie Stepmom, which is wonderful. There you get a sense that there are some unhealed wounds. And so how does that play into all the feelings involved in remarrying? It's complicated. Yeah.
It is really complicated. So talking about sort of emotional baggage towards it, how important is seeking outside support or even counseling for couples who are entering that second marriage?
Oh, I think that, I certainly think that helping professionals who work with step families are incredible in the perspectives that they can offer and the guidance that they can bestow upon families who are navigating these unmapped terrain. I do think that we don't necessarily need to, and this is something that we can also benefit from in therapy, we don't necessarily have to resolve the issues in order to create satisfying step family dynamics. And so here's what I mean by that. There are research studies there's one in particular that used a national sample of Canadian adults and followed them over a period of 20 years. And they looked at which step couples or remarried couples were most likely to divorce after the 20-year period. And they had them identify the challenge that was most stressful in their step families. And they had both members of the couple identify the most challenging stressor. And then they looked at whether both members of the couple were on the same page about what was most challenging. So what they found was that the couples who were most likely to divorce had nothing to do with the actual stressor that they identified. So their likelihood of divorce was not predicted by what they identified as being most stressful. It wasn't even predicted by the severity of that stressor. So if they rated it a 5 out of a 10 or a 10 out of a 10. What was most predictive of whether or not they divorced was whether or not the couple was on the same page about which stressor was their most serious stressor. So just consensus, even without it being resolved, saying that we are on the same page about this thing being stressful was what protected them from divorce the most. And so thinking about therapy, we don't necessarily have to resolve everything that's stressful about step family life in order to be happy in our marriages. But even just being on the same page, validating each other and saying, yes, this is really stressful and we're in it together, and reaching consensus about that protected them in terms of their risk of divorce. So therapy can be beneficial for a range of, so many reasons. But what I would say to couples is that therapy isn't only effective insofar as you resolve the stressor. Being on the same page about the stressor being stressful is also really beneficial for your marriage.
And it must be really important, especially with dealing with so much of your past understanding of yourself in a relationship. Because usually, like when you talk about divorce, there's usually something that sort of underlies it. So trying to understand why that is or what that was, I think would also be a very important thing to bring onto a second marriage.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we are shaped by our pasts, right? And so what we've been through in a first marriage or divorce affects us and affects our second marriages or subsequent marriages in ways that we're not always privy to. It can happen at a subconscious level. And so certainly therapy or clinical perspectives can help bring those undercurrents to the surface so that you can really deal with them.
Perfect. So now we're going into the practice and habit part of the show. So talking about your own practices, what is a practice that you do or that you go through to sort of improve your relationship in a marriage?
There are studies to suggest that having a once a week check-in, what you might call similar to the State of the Union, which happens annually, for instance, in the US, the state of the relationship is like a once a week check-in about how your relationship is going. So for example, on a Sunday evening, checking in with your spouse about how things are going in the marriage, right? And really talking about the stressors that we're facing, how we're feeling about those stressors, but giving protected time, giving a space, really designating a time to talk about it. Otherwise, so much can become swept under the rug. And especially for remarried couples who might have a lot of competing demands on their time, right? They're raising kids and their own kids and stepkids, and there's so much to attend to. It's really important to protect time, to set aside time to check in about the marriage. And so talking about how things are going and doing that regularly is critical. I mean, open communication is so key. And in those conversations, I would say that the most important thing, one of my favorite quotes about communication, which I talk about with my students, is that the greatest communication problem is that we don't listen to understand. We listen to reply. So when our partner's talking, we're thinking about how we're going to respond, right? Yeah. We're thinking about what we're going to say in response to that, as opposed to truly listening to understand what our partner is saying, which means being curious about their perspective, asking follow-up questions, right? We're really trying to get to the heart of what they're experiencing and thinking and feeling before we're thinking about our own reply to what our partner is sharing, to the extent that we can listen to understand as opposed to listening to reply, then we both understand each other more deeply. And so often, what we need when we're experiencing some difficulty is not even to solve it. In fact, most relationship researchers agree that the vast majority of conflict in relationships is not solvable, which isn't to say that people should run or that something's wrong. It's to normalize that human beings are complicated and most of our differences we just learn to live with as opposed to actually solving them. And I think that really frees us to not necessarily always be hyper-focused on fixing it, but instead to be hyper-focused on understanding each other's perspective. That even if we can't resolve this issue, hearing each other, validating each other, even if we disagree, perhaps especially when we disagree, to say, I understand where you're coming from. I get it, right? And to really ask questions that help us understand each other's perspective. So listening to understand, validating differing perspectives is so critical in relationships.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also really interesting because when you talk about, like, we always listen to reply. So it's like it becomes an interview. Well, like we find one thing that's interesting and we focus on that until it's our turn to speak. And that's what we talk about.
Right. Oh, that's such a great, and I do qualitative research for my profession. And so I'm interviewing research participants constantly. Mm-hmm. And you're right. I mean, we often have an interview protocol when I'm conducting an interview with a participant, and there are certain questions I want to get to, but to the extent that I can suspend my preconceived map and just be with my participant and follow where they go. I've never drawn that connection, but you're absolutely right that that's exactly the same in relationships, right? That in relationships, instead of trying to hit on the items in our agenda, instead to listen to our partner and go down unexpected paths. And what's critical is that both partners are willing to do that. Because of course, if one does that and the other doesn't, I wouldn't call that a healthy relationship. But yeah, I think that's a beautiful metaphor for what that looks like in relationships.
Well, it's perfect. So how do you think that this practice and this sort of like weekly check-in practice, how do you think that it improves family life as well as sort of life in general?
Yeah, well, it certainly, I think, improves family life in that it fosters more open communication. In families with children, couples set the stage for the family dynamics that trickle down to kids. And so to the extent that spouses are communicating openly, they're more likely to then do that with their children, and children are more likely to communicate openly with parents. Certainly open communication is a signpost of, healthy dynamics often in families. And not just on a family level, but how does it improve life in general? I like the second part of that question because I think that when we are curious about what our partners are sharing with us, when we are truly open and receptive to what other people in our families and our relationships are bringing forward, when we are practicing that openness, that receptivity, I think that spills over into all areas of our lives, right? And I just think there's great value in being incredibly curious about ourselves and each other and the world around us, and staying open to everything that unfolds to us, and not to the extent that we cannot attach preconceived notions or preconceived judgments of what our partners are saying or feeling or thinking or things that we're going through, but to truly stay open and curious, I think helps us move through life, but certainly also our families much more gracefully.
It's very interesting how you say it in a sort of a life sense, because I always love that part of the question as well, and how each sort of different practice really helps in how we go through our daily life. So I always love hearing the different definitions and the different ways people, a lot of the guests take that, and that's why it's probably my favorite question to ask out of the whole show. And it's so varying depending on the practice that takes place.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely.
So the next part of the show is going through the questions from audience members that have been sent through to us. So the first question is, how do I make sure the issues from my first marriage aren't repeated into my second?
Oh, great question. Being aware of what those issues are is first and foremost key, right? So I think having your thumb on the pulse of the things that you don't want to repeat in a second marriage is absolutely critical. I mean, it doesn't mean necessarily that we won't subconsciously repeat some dynamics that we've learned. Just like we learn anything else in life, how we learn to communicate with partners, how we learn to engage in conflict, those are habits that we learn through repetition. And so it takes practice to unlearn those habits so that we can learn new habits in a second relationship or a second marriage, right? And so I think first, being critically aware of what it is that you want to unlearn or not repeat. But second, of course, is making conscious efforts to practice those habits differently, which requires a lot of self-awareness. And I do think that's certainly where therapy can be really helpful in sensitizing us and sort of getting a third perspective of things that we aren't ourselves aware that we're repeating, that we're doing again in a second marriage that we also might have done in our first. And so those outside perspectives can be, incredibly helpful.
Okay, perfect. Next question is, how do I prepare my kids for the new parent, which includes stepchildren?
Oh, wonderful question. I first suggest that parents take their time in introducing a new dating partner to their kids, right? It can be difficult for children to become close to someone that their parent is dating just for them to break up and they no longer see that person. And then they become close to someone else and they break up, right? And that repeated cycle of becoming close to someone and then losing access to that person can be hard for kids. So first, I would recommend generally waiting to introduce children to new partners until you're pretty certain that that person is going to be around for the long haul. Mm-hmm. And even then, I recommend introducing that person very slowly, right? Depending on the ages of your kids, maybe they're just at the playground and this new person, is there in a way that doesn't put too much pressure on the child and that new step parent to bond, right? They're just kind of introduced slowly to the family. They're around, the children get to know who they are, but it's at a very slow, reasonable pace. I don't recommend, introducing someone as your fiance that you're going to, right? It should be a slow and integral process.
Yeah.
So I think that helps then with the preparation. So then when parents do say, right, hey, I'm engaged, or we're going to move in, or this person is going to be your step parent, that doesn't come as a shock to kids because they've already gotten to know this person slowly over time. And they've gotten to know this person as a friend, right? Step parents really, if they want to build the best relationships with kids, studies suggest that they should build a friendship with them and not step into a parental role, but the role of a friend. And so laying that groundwork is really critical. In terms of, okay, we've been dating for a while, we're going to marry, and I'm preparing my kids now for that transition, for moving in with this person, for blending our families. Being as honest as possible in terms of what the changes are going to look like can really help alleviate, children's anxieties. A lot of their anxiety comes from not knowing everything that, are we moving into a new house? Am I going to have a room? And am I going to have to share a room? Is it going to change how often I'm seeing my other parent at my other household, right? There's so many question marks that children don't have the answers to. And sometimes parents might not have the answers to some of those questions either. And so to the extent that parents can be honest, right? And tell them the things that they know and the things that they're still figuring it out, and that, that they'll continue to communicate about. I mean, being as honest as possible and normalizing children's concerns, right? It's okay for kids to be sad or reluctant. And parents, in their excitement, again, for their child to bond with their new partner, well-intentioned parents can sometimes be dismissive of children's needs. And so, I'm speaking from experience here with one of my parents' second marriages. I remember the enthusiasm for which she really wanted us to bond with her new fiance. And there was a lot of pressure on accepting this person into the family instantly and immediately. And I think that parents in their enthusiasm want their kids also to be enthusiastic. And so I think it's really okay for parents to, it's great for parents to normalize that, you know, this is hard and it's okay to be sad. And I feel sad sometimes too, right? I feel scared sometimes too about X, Y, and Z. Like parents can model vulnerability for their kids and say, you know, it's all right to feel unsure about all of this. That's sometimes likely to make kids feel even more receptive to the step parent, just to be told that it's okay if they don't always like this person, right? But then they might like that person even more. So kids just need to be told that, you know, all of the feelings that they're feeling are okay. And to the extent that parents can really check in with their kids about how they're feeling can do wonders in terms of preparing kids for those transitions.
It's really interesting. And the final question, this is a pretty big one. How do I negotiate with my former second spouse who still wants to be involved with the children even after I'm remarried to the third partner?
Oh, certainly if there are circumstances that maybe led to the divorce that also led to custody arrangements where kids might have full custody with, you know, a parent and a step parent and not have much access to their other parent. If there are circumstances surrounding safety where that's the case, right, then it might be appropriate for children not to have, you know, as much access to that parent if it's unsafe for them. Most often that's not the case. And children, you know, might have 50-50 custody or see both of their parents at different times. And children not feeling like they have to choose, like they have done something wrong by loving a step parent and also loving and wanting to be close to their biological parent is critical. Part of the problem of the nuclear family model is that then when parents remarry, they think, oh, well, I'm recreating a nuclear family. We now have a two-parent family, and this third parent in another household is no longer needed, is no longer relevant. Children need access to the people that they're close with. A disruption to that relationship with their non-residential parent can be incredibly damaging to them if they lose access to a loving parent figure. And so creating co-parenting systems that include parents across households, right, including the non-residential parent in co-parenting, helps children not feel caught in the middle, like they have to choose, like they feel torn between their parents. There's a gigantic body of literature on the phenomenon of bad-mouthing the other parent, right? Or inappropriate disclosures to kids about their other parent. Mm-hmm. And not surprisingly, that can be incredibly harmful to kids' development when a parent is talking badly about the other parent. I used to teach a divorce education class in Missouri, in the US, for parents who were divorcing with minor age children. And often parents would say, I just want to prepare my child because their other parent is going to let them down. And I don't want them to think, I don't want them to be hurt. And so I'm trying to tell them now. And children are very wise, first of all. They tend to learn on their own without parents' input what the truth of the situation is. Mm-hmm. Parents really don't need to further that along by bad-mouthing the other parent. It can make children ultimately less close to the parent who's doing the bad-mouthing because it's very uncomfortable for them to hear negative things about the other parent. So to the extent that parents can avoid shutting that third parent out and instead including them in the co-parenting system, children benefit from that. They really do. Again, unless there are circumstances where that's unsafe, and then that's another situation. But if that's not the case, then parents can do incredible things by modeling family complexity and embracing parenting figures across households?
I think it's very fascinating to me just how much we're needing to, like a lot of people, they also deal with their own sort of need to find a partner or to find a partner, or like dating and finding someone new after this first marriage. But then the kids are also still trying to understand as to a whole why that marriage didn't work out. So like there's that whole balance of trying to be there for your kid, but also trying to understand that you need to move on for you, that you deserve to find someone. So like I honestly don't know how a lot of families are able to do it when it comes to balancing both of them and balancing the whole idea of moving on, but still being in some sort of reminder that the first marriage even existed.
Oh, absolutely. And studies show that children do best when their parents are doing well, right? Mm-hmm. That children's well-being is connected to their parents' well-being. And so when parents stay in unhealthy marriages, even if it's a first marriage, nuclear family, if there is a lot of conflict and parents are really unhappy, children are generally worse off if their parents don't divorce. Mm-hmm. If divorce is going to reduce children's exposure to conflict, then they are better off when their parents do separate, right? So parents' well-being is so critical. How well parents are doing, if parents are in healthy situations, then they're able to be better parents to their kids, right? Even if that means leaving a first marriage and establishing, a post-divorce family.
Mm-hmm. So now we're coming up to the open mic part of the show, the very last part, the very last segment. I get you to talk about anything that you are either passionate about or a personal project that you are currently working on. So we have about less than 5 minutes. So I'll get you to have the floor and just be able to talk in about anything that you wanted to share with the audience.
Sure. I am currently working on a project called Mother Stepmother Allies and Father Stepfather Allies. So I am doing joint interviews with moms and stepmoms in the same family and dads and stepdads in the same family. And I'm recruiting specifically for moms and stepmoms who get along, or dads and stepdads who get along. And they are talking with me about the benefits of being friends with one another and not having animosity, and just the advantages of establishing co-parenting systems across households that work well for everyone. There's a lot of the dominant narrative is that moms and stepmoms hate each other, that they're in competition with one another, that they shouldn't get along, that there's jealousy, that there's hurt feelings. So all of the people I'm talking to are folks who get along, and what it can look like to work together in the kids' best interest, because these are families who really have embraced their complexity. I talked with a mom, stepmom dyad last week, who they go on family vacations together, their whole family. Wow. And they were on a cruise in a hot tub, and someone that they had just met said, "Oh, how do you guys know each other?" And she said, "Oh, well, he's my ex-husband and that's his wife." And they were all friends. They're good friends, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's a project that really illustrates what's possible if people can resolve the hurt feelings that often are there, and just decide that, as one of my participants said, too many things in life are hard. I don't need my relationship with my ex to be hard. I don't want my relationship with his new wife to be hard. It makes all of our lives easier for us to just be friends. And so they are, and they're not alone. There's lots of people who I've spoken with who really illustrate, like embody that really resilient step family model. And so my work is really shining a light right now on what it can look like for families to do this well. And so I'm very excited about that work.
That sounds like it's negating so many stereotypes that come into place.
Right. Yes. I think that often we do work that focuses on the kids, and I think that we should, but I also think we have to do work that really understands the complexity of the emotions that parents are going through, because there's so many hidden emotions that are complicated, that are unresolved, and that get in the way of healthy co-parenting. after divorce and after remarriage. And so what does it look like to just put all of that on the table and deal with it and grapple with it and to come out stronger on the other side?
Well, I would love to end that on a positive note and to show that there is so many different types of families that do have such a big positive way of going through life, especially in this situation. Thank you so much, Caroline, for coming on and joining me and sharing a lot of information about the different ways that remarriage and second marriages and third marriages can exist and just be positive in terms of how we perceive life as well.
Thank you so much. It was really my pleasure. Thank you.
If there's any way that audience members would like to get in touch with you, is there a way that they are able to?
Sure. I am on Twitter at the handle Caroline_Sanner. My email address is csanner@vt.edu. If folks are interested in hearing more about any of the research I've talked about, I'd be really happy to connect them with resources. So those are probably the best ways to reach me.
Okay, perfect. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. And if you want any more information, everything will be in the link below, including the handle for Instagram as well as her email for Caroline as well. Follow us if you want any new episodes that are coming up. We're talking about so many different things that I can barely keep up as to what we're talking about. Thank you so much for listening, guys, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. You've been listening to Altogether, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant, and thanks for tuning in.